They flew at night in fragile wooden planes, engines silent, courage louder than steel. No armor, no radios, just maps, compasses, and the patience of darkness. German soldiers gave them a name whispered with fear: night witches. Their bombs were small, but their persistence was endless. They did not seek glory. They sought the next target, the next night, the next. Return to base. Their story is not legend. It is history carried by wind, moonlight, and women who refused to be forgotten. In 1941, when the German invasion threatened Soviet soil, the Kremlin authorized 3 all-female aviation regiments. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment would become the most feared among. Their aircraft were Polikarpov P-2 biplanes, open cockpit, plywood frame, designed for training, not war. Yet in the hands of these pilots, they became instruments of precision under moonlight. Volunteers arrived from universities, farms, factories, students who traded textbooks for flight maps, silk scarves for military caps. Their training was short, harsh, and unforgiving. At night, they learned to land by starlight and navigate by wind over fields, without runway lights. Their mission was not to overpower the enemy, but to unsettle him, harass supply lines, disrupt rest, make sleep a luxury German troops could not trust. And so, each evening, as others settled into tents or dugouts, the women of the 588th rose quietly into dark skies, where sound told stories and silence delivered fear. Their preparation did not begin in the cockpit, it began on the ground, where instructors stripped away hesitation and replaced it with certainty. The women learned to identify engine sounds by ear, calculate distance by instinct, and feel altitude not through instruments but through wind on skin and hum of wings. Their uniforms were often men's hand-me-downs, boots stuffed with rags for fit, sleeves rolled, cuffs stitched. They flew without parachutes in early missions. Weight mattered more than safety. Every kilogram saved meant an extra bomb. Polikarpov P-2 aircraft rattled in cold air, fabric wings trembling against the night. No armor shielded them. No radio guided them. Only courage, teamwork, and experience sharpened by necessity. At bases far from cities, they slept in wooden huts, their breath visible in winter. Air, blankets thin, mornings colder than the cockpits they would soon return to. They did not grow harder because they wanted to. They grew harder because war demanded it and because endurance, not comfort, became their currency for survival. Their first combat missions arrived without ceremony. No trumpet marked departure. No commander gave dramatic speeches. At dusk, engines coughed awake, wings shivered in gathering cold, and the crews rolled toward darkness with maps pressed under gloved hands. They flew low, often just above tree lines where air smelled of soil and smoke, and any sudden light could become a threat. The P-2's fabric wings rustled rather than roared. Pilots whispered to navigators because even their voices felt too loud for the night. When searchlights swept the sky, women pressed aircraft into tight turns at low altitude, trusting wood, cloth, and instinct over steel. Anti-aircraft fire crackled below, each burst a reminder that their greatest protection was invisibility and silence. Bomb loads were small, but intent was not. They aimed for supply depots, rail lines, ammunition stores, not to destroy armies, but to erode their rest, night after night. Their first landings were quiet too. No cheers greeted them. Only nods, steam from engines cooling, and the knowledge that fear had not turned them back. Their aircraft did not rely on speed, armor, or advanced instruments. Instead, they relied on something rarer in war: stillness. Approaching targets, pilots reduced throttle until engines sputtered into near silence. In the final seconds before release, they cut power entirely. The P-2 glided through night air like a shadow passing between stars, wood, and fabric, whispering against wind. German sentries listened for incoming engines and heard nothing, only the faint sweep of wings just above treetops. Bombs fell quietly. Explosions came seconds later, and by the time soldiers looked upward, darkness held no shape, no trail to follow. It was this tactic, this silent descent through night, that earned them their name. German troops claimed the soft rustling sounded like broom bristles sweeping across sky and whispered a single phrase: Nachtwechsel, night witches. The women never chose the title. War gave it to them, and like everything else in those years, they accepted it without ceremony, simply as another duty to carry into the next night's flight. The aircraft that carried them was humble even by training standards. The Polikarpov P-2 was light enough for 2 people to lift a wing, built from wood ribs and fabric stretched tight under dope varnish. In winter, frost formed along struts, metal fittings stung bare skin, and wind cut through layers of wool as if fabric were not there. They flew open cockpit, goggles icing at altitude, fingers numbing inside gloves, breath freezing against scarves. Controls trembled in cold air, canvas surfaces flexing with every gust. The P-2 was forgiving in stall and agile at low speeds, yet fragile under tracer fire. A single round in the wrong place could turn wood and cloth into falling ash. Still, the women flew not once per night, but often 8 or more missions, landing only long enough for ground crews to reload small bombs and refuel from cans carried by hand. Hardship was not obstacle, it was routine. They learned that endurance in thin air was not measured by comfort, but by the willingness to take flight again before warmth returned to skin. Their missions relied not on instruments, but on eyes, memory, and sky. The P-2 cockpit offered no radar, no modern radio guidance, and only minimal gauges. Instead, pilots traced routes across villages, rivers, and forest lines they memorized in daylight. Navigators held paper maps on clipboards, edges soft from use, corners creased by cold fingers. They used pocket compasses, angle calipers, and the constant presence of stars to measure direction when clouds allowed. From altitude, towns glimmered faintly under blackout shades, train yards glowed only when locomotives stoked boilers, and torch light from supply roads appeared briefly before soldiers covered flames. Each landmark, each shadowed curve of land served as guidance. Inside the cockpit, communication was minimal. Pilots touched elbows to signal turns, nodded through goggles when ready, and shared brief, steady words only when needed. Their strength lay not in speed or weapon weight, but in the quiet trust between two aircrews sharing unlit sky. They flew not to reach targets quickly, but to reach them surely, and return for the next night, no matter how dark the route became. In their first months at the front, loss arrived the way night missions did, quietly, without warning, and often without witness. Aircraft that lifted from dirt runways at dusk sometimes did not return by dawn. Searchlights on the horizon told their stories in flickers, tracer lines rising through sky marked the last moments of crews no one could help. When a plane failed to appear in morning fog, there were no grand ceremonies, no formal speeches. A bunk remained empty, a flight cap rested untouched, a name was spoken, softly but not for long. War did not permit lingering over absence. The women folded grief the way they folded maps, precisely, without crease. Wasted, carried close to heart, but never allowed to interfere with flight orders. Engines warmed again. Hands steadied controls again. And as the next night came, seats once filled by friends were occupied by new volunteers who learned from silence what duty required. Their courage did not shout. It prepared quietly and rose again into the dark. As their missions multiplied, German defenses adapted. Spotlights carved through night like blades, sweeping fields and treetops in wide arcs. Anti-aircraft crews learned to listen for the faint rustle of fabric wings firing into silence when they sensed movement. The night witches answered not with force, but with altitude shifts measured in instinct. They flew so low that branches brushed landing gear and rivers reflected silhouettes as thin as shadows on glass. Sometimes they climbed suddenly, letting searchlights lose them in angles. Other times they dropped straight toward earth, trusting darkness to hide. Descent. Shell bursts painted brief white flowers in sky, here and gone petals of danger scattering in seconds. Pilots felt concussions through wooden frames, heard shrapnel whistle past fabric skin, and steadied hands on trembling controls. Survival depended not on armor but timing, when to cut throttle, when to glide, when to trust wind over engine. They learned the math of danger by repetition, until fear became calculation, and calculation became routine. Night did not protect them, discipline did. Bond among crews did not grow from celebration, but from repetition. Night after night, returning to the same canvas tents, the same wooden huts, the same smell of fuel and frost clinging to flight suits. Between missions, they patched fabric with needles and doped linen, tightened bolts with cold fingers, and brushed frost from wings before sunrise softened it. Ground crews and pilots worked side by side, neither above the other. Everyone understood that survival belonged to effort shared, not rank worn. Sleep came in short stretches, coats pulled over shoulders, boots resting nearby, in case orders arrived sooner than expected. Voices stayed low, not from secrecy but from fatigue that settled deep and steady. Yet tired lips still found room for brief laughter over burned tea shared, chocolate, or a letter read twice simply because paper felt warm in hand. Their strength was not noise, but presence, a quiet certainty that each woman would return to the wing or bomb cradle or map table without needing to be. That's why. They flew together because war demanded it. They stayed together because trust allowed it. Their missions rarely carried large explosive loads. Each aircraft lifted only 2 or 3 small bombs secured beneath slender wings. Their power did not lie in a single strike, but in frequency. Dozens of sorties. Through one night, hundreds across a week. Targets were chosen not to annihilate, but to interrupt. Supply dumps, artillery. Positions, fuel storage, forward camps where rest mattered as much as rations. A quiet field before midnight could be restless by dawn, sleep splintered by. Relentless arrivals of distant engines that appeared only in fragments. Precision was expected, not spectacle. Bombs were released by stopwatch, altitude guessed by feel, angle of descent, judged from tree-lean and moon shape. German reports recorded damage modest in size but heavy in consequence. Equipment delayed, repairs constant, nerves worn thin. Soldiers who slept lightly feared sky more than ground. The night witches never promised destruction. They promised interruption. And in war, interruption repeated, disciplined, unending, can become a weapon sharper than force. Not every return brought wheels to prepared earth. Sometimes engines coughed low over forest edges, fuel nearly gone, fabric torn by branches or shrapnel. In those nights, pilots guided platoons toward open patches of field or frozen pasture, trusting instinct more than visibility. Grass bent beneath wooden skids, wheels bumped over ruts, and silence settled quickly after propellers slowed to stillness. There was no radio to announce trouble, no beacon to mark position. They stepped down into darkness, listened to wind, and waited for moonlight to decide next steps. Repairs were simple only in appearance. Canvas patches sewn by lantern glow, wire tightened with pliers carried in coat. Pockets, fuel poured from hand-carried tins, each motion quiet and methodical. When engines turned again, it was not triumph, only continuation. They lifted into sky because there was another target marked on a map. Another hour before dawn, another duty waiting. In war, some victories roar across steel runways. There's whispered across fields no one named. The regiment did not build itself. It formed under the guidance of women who understood both aviation and sacrifice, led by figures like Marina Raskova, navigator, record-setting pilot, an organizer trusted by command in a time when trust was scarce. She helped turn volunteers into aircrew, students into soldiers, and the unfamiliar into routine. Leadership within the regiment reflected her example. Rank carried responsibility, not distance. Commanders walked flight lines at dusk, checked straps on bomb racks, and reviewed maps kneeling beside crews in dim light. No voice rose in anger unnecessarily. Urgency lived in tone, not volume. Orders emphasized preparation over bravado. Know the route. Know the wind. Know the silence between engine and glide. Respect in this unit was earned not through speeches, but through readiness. The steady presence of those who flew first when visibility fell and weather tightened. Their leaders did not shield them from danger. They showed how to meet it with clarity rather than fury. Winter on the front did not arrive gently. It swept across airfields with wind sharp enough to cut through wool and leather, settling frost on wings before fuel pumps finished their work. The platoon, built of wood and canvas, felt each degree of cold like a living thing, joints stiffening, fabric tightening, metal fittings burning hands through gloves. Pilots wrapped scarves tight, goggles clouding until fingers wiped frost from glass, breath forming crystals on collar edges. Fuel thickened in cans. Mechanics warmed engine oil over small stoves before pouring it by hand, steam rising from metal like breath from tired lungs. During flight, wind pressed against faces until skin numbed, and controls resisted like ropes pulled through ice. Fingers ached long before altitude changed, and landing in snow meant trusting faint shadows of trees to mark ground. No weather report prepared them. Observation did. They knew the sound of an engine struggling in frozen air and the weight of frost forming along wings. Winter did not stop them. It simply became another language they learned to fly through. In early reports, German officers refused to believe women flew these missions. Intelligence notes called the aircraft primitive, the tactics amateur, the attacks nuisance strikes unworthy of serious acknowledgement. Yet the interruptions continued night after night, and units along the front recorded sleepless weeks traced to engines that barely reached 100 horsepower. At first, disbelief insulated the regiment from targeted countermeasures. Enemy units dismissed sightings as errors, the product of stress or imagination. When proof arrived, Fragments of fabric wings and logbook scraps recovered. From crash sites it came as surprise, not validation. Underestimation did not flatter the women, it served them. Being ignored offered a margin of freedom in sky crowded with danger. In camp, no one celebrated enemy doubt. They did not measure pride in praise or recognition. They measured it in missions flown, in nights survived, and maps updated for the next sortie. If the enemy learned slowly, it did not change their rhythm. Purpose did not depend on being seen, only on returning to fly again. With each mission, the night changed from obstacle to companion. Pilots learned to read horizon lines by tone, not shape. Darker forests against slightly softer sky, rivers reflecting moonlight in thin silver threads. They judged altitude from tree scent rising in cool air and felt wind shift through ribs of canvas like fingers tracing direction. Instruments were minimal, instinct grew to fill empty space. A change in engine pitch warned of carburetor icing, a faint vibration of wing. Wires signaled crosswind before instruments reacted. Navigators touched map corners to keep orientation steady in turbulence, marking progress by barn roofs, road bends, and brief gleams from guarded fires below. Experience did not make danger smaller, it made reaction quieter. Where fear once rose quickly, focus settled instead, a habit shaped not by daring but by repetition. Skill in this regiment did not shout. It arrived as silence that felt certain, hands steady on controls, and voices that spoke only when necessary. Night did not hide them, it accepted them as part of its rhythm. Resources at frontline airstrips arrived unevenly and often late. Spare parts came in crates stamped for other units, tools passed from hand to hand until handles smoothed with wear and fabric patches were cut from. Uniforms too torn to mend. The platoon was simple, but simplicity required care. Mechanics balanced propellers by touch when scales were not available, filed spark plugs clean rather than replace them, and mixed oil by kerosene lantern, light when supply drums ran thin. Pilots carried pencils not just for charts but for marking fuel levels on cans, each stroke measuring whether another sortie was possible before dawn. Ropes served where steel cable might have been, and canvas strips reinforced seams the way stitches reinforce cloth worn by work. No one complained loudly. Complaints did not make engines turn, and shortages did not prevent flight schedules from filling. They learned efficiency from necessity, patience from absence, and pride from knowing. Aircraft took shape each night not through abundance but through hands unwilling to pause. When the regiment first arrived near male aviation units, curiosity met them before acceptance. Some pilots raised brows at fabric wings and open cockpits, others doubted whether night sorties in training aircraft could shape a battlefield already crowded with steel and fire. But doubt softened not through argument, but through repetition. Night after night, the platoons lifted before heavier aircraft warmed engines and returned when most of the field slept. Mechanics watched women patch canvas in frost. Officers watched maps change as harassment raids shifted enemy logistics. Gradually, recognition appeared not in speeches but in gestures. Share tools on cold mornings, offers of fuel drums rolled across muddy ground, hands raised in quiet acknowledgement as aircraft taxied out without spotlight or escort. Respect here was not awarded by decree. It grew from endurance observed up close. The women did not ask for praise and they did not wait for validation. Their purpose lived in the next mission, not in others' opinion. Yet along flight lines and maintenance pits, nods replaced doubts and nods were enough. As campaigns stretched across months, missions increased not by choice but by necessity. Each advance demanded pressure on enemy supply lines. Each retreat required confusion sewn into night routes. Sleep broke into fragments, meals into minutes, and rest into brief stretches. Between wing inspections and map briefings, fatigue settled behind eyes, lived in shoulders, crept into hands that tied scarf. Not slower with each passing week. Yet no one called their exhaustion extraordinary. It simply became another layer worn like uniforms, familiar and unremarked. Routine strengthened them. Map, compass, fuel check. Patch, warm engine, glide pattern review. Each action repeated so often that sequence offered comfort even as skies remained cold and uncertain. Some nights, laughter came unplanned, a shared whisper over cracked mugs, a quiet joke about frost on eyelashes. Other nights, silence filled the airfield like smoke, thick and necessary. They discovered strength not in bursts of courage but in returning to tasks. Without ceremony, letting repetition do what armor could not, steady the mind, when fear would not leave. With every month the regiment flew, German defenses adjusted. Searchlight crews shortened sweep intervals, anti-air batteries shifted positions more often, and patrols began watching sky not for roar but for absence. The quiet where wings might glide unseen. Wire microphones were planted near likely approach paths to catch faint propeller rhythm, reflective markers placed along roads to track silhouettes against moonlight, and gunners were told to fire at soundless arcs rather than visible threats. The night witches answered by flying lower still, using tree shadow as shield, river mist as cover, and cloud edges as corridors. Navigators marked not just rail depots and storage yards, but searchlight habits and anti-air timing, learning rhythms the way musicians learn meter. Missions grew sharper, margins thinner, yet resolve stayed level. Danger did not surprise them, routine carried it quietly. In enemy records, frustration appeared in clipped notes and shifting tactics. In their own logs, the women wrote only coordinates, wind direction, fuel count, and space left for the next entry, assuming return. As operations continued, their efforts reached ears beyond the airstrips. Reports traveled up command channels, noting consistent disruption of enemy rest and supply routes despite limited equipment and severe conditions. Commendations arrived in telegram form, clipped and formal, acknowledging sorties completed and targets harassed across long winter months. Awards followed, not suddenly but gradually. Hero titles granted to some. Commendation ribbons sewn by hand onto worn jackets, and brief announcements read at dusk while engines cooled from the night's first flights. Yet applause never echoed across runways. Recognition in this regiment did not bring parades or leave marks in dust. Beyond footprints returning to tents, orders remained steady, missions unchanged. Pilots accepted medals the way they accepted maps as part of duty, neither sought nor refused. They pinned honors beside patches, checked fuel levels, and prepared again. Pride showed not in celebration but in readiness, in knowing acknowledgement did not alter the sky they flew through or the work waiting before dawn. Their value did not rise with rank. It simply became harder to overlook. Night flight did not only threaten from below. In darkness unbroken by cockpit lamps or runway lights, aircraft sometimes crossed paths too closely, wings whispering past each other in black air where depth was guesswork and timing everything. Navigators leaned forward against wind, calling headings in low voices, guiding pilots around unseen hazards. Treetops, smoke columns, and at times other returning aircraft gliding without engine sound. When near misses happened, they passed in seconds. A sudden shadow cutting across starlight, a gasp caught beneath scarves, controls nudged just enough to change fate. No exclamations followed, no panic retold loudly. Instead, crews exchanged a brief nod or glove touch, acknowledging danger, without magnifying it. They had no space for dramatics. Each breath belonged to preparation for the next turn, the next descent, the next landing on a strip lit only by shielded lanterns set low against frozen ground. Their safety came not from luck alone, but from trust grown through repetition. Instinct sharpened beside the same hands, night after night, until silence itself felt shared. As their reputation spread, the enemy assigned experienced night fighter crews to intercept them. German aircraft, powerful and fast, searched for shapes in moonlight and listened for engines stronger than the whisper of a P2. Yet speed became disadvantage. Sleek fighters overshot targets before seeing them, circling back through sky, where wooden wings made almost no mark. The P2 flew slower than stall speed of aircraft sent to destroy it. Pursuit often meant losing sight rather than closing distance. Pilots did not rely on luck. They dropped altitude quickly, skimmed treetops so closely that branches brushed canvas, and used river fog as shield. Navigators held breath through glides, scanning darkness not for threat of machine guns alone, but for mistakes in judgment that came when moonlight turned ground to shadowed glass. Some nights, fighters passed so near engines rattled from wake turbulence. Other nights, threat remained unseen, only felt in tension through scarf cloth and tight jaw. Their aircraft were outmatched in power, yet not in patience nor in the discipline that turned fragility into survival. Damage did not always mean loss. Sometimes aircraft returned with canvas scorched at wing edges, splinters in struts, and bullet holes where moonlight passed through fabric in uneven patterns. Engines ticked unevenly as they cooled, and melted dope varnish carried a sharp, bitter scent, faint but unmistakable to those who knew how close danger had come. Ground crews approached without alarm. They traced shrapnel paths by fingertip, measured tears against patches cut from spare cloth, and stitched edges tight beneath lantern glow. Needles passed through fabric with steady rhythm, metal glinting briefly before disappearing into shadow again. Pilots stood nearby, gloves tucked beneath arms, recounting course headings in calm tones, not to dramatize but to ensure accuracy for the next flight. No ceremony marked survival. A patched wing meant only one thing: flight must resume when fuel drums rolled forward and frost lifted from runway grass. The P-2 was never invincible. It simply endured because those who flew and repaired it did the same. Some missions carried them farther than routine allowed, deeper into terrain, where rivers bent unfamiliar, where distant train stations glowed only faintly, and where maps smoothed into guesses between forest shadows. They took off knowing fuel margins were thin, weather unpredictable, and navigation errors unforgiving. The moon served as both ally and threat. It lit farmland and rail yards for aiming, yet also brightened sky enough for watchers below to search upward. Over unfamiliar stretches, navigators leaned close to maps, tracing fingers along inked lines until memory replaced measurement. Pilots adjusted throttle by instinct, saving drops of fuel the way others saved ammunition. Sometimes return routes brushed danger twice, once into enemy territory, once out again, and dawn crept faster than engines could carry them home. Landing in first morning light felt both relief and risk, wheels touching earth as birds stirred across fields and shadows shortened against huts. No one spoke loudly after such flights. They simply loosened scarves, exhaled frost from breath, and marked coordinates quietly for the next crew scheduled to follow similar paths. Not every mission ended with wheels on friendly soil. A handful of crews were forced down behind enemy lines by mechanical failure, fuel miscalculation, or sudden fire, tracing canvas with sparks. Touching earth in hostile territory changed silence of sky into silence of caution. Those captured met interrogators who questioned not only tactics but the fact of their presence. Some German officers struggled to accept that women flew through night in open cockpit biplanes. Documents record disbelief as much as inquiry. Prison did not rewrite their poise. Sources note calm speech, refusal to embellish or plead, statements given in clipped military form rather than defiance or apology. They carried duty with them even when flight logs could no longer guide their nights. Repatriation came for some. Others were counted only in missing reports and quiet acknowledgments in unit rosters. Their absence did not stop missions. Duty did not pause for grief in camp. It folded loss neatly and continued the schedule marked on chalkboards at dusk. As the front pushed westward, towns once held by enemy forces fell quiet under new flags, and airfields shifted mile by mile toward unfamiliar horizons. The rhythm did not change. New coordinates replaced old ones on map corners, supply lists rewrote themselves, and P-2 wings lifted into different winds but familiar darkness. Victories elsewhere did not reduce their schedule. Advancement meant longer distances to rail yards not yet taken, colder nights above open countryside, and new patterns in enemy defenses adapting to retreat. Crews returned smelling of engine oil and winter air, scarves stiff with frost, goggles streaked where they wiped condensation with gloves. Mechanics rolled fuel drums across mud scarred by wheels, and boots patched canvas as though war were only beginning, not nearing its end. They did not fly for triumph. They flew because orders carried weight, because habit became responsibility, and because stopping early felt foreign after years of motion. Even as victory approached, nights remained long, and duty remained steady. Near war's end, there was no single moment when the regiment knew a final mission had arrived. Schedules remained pinned beside lanterns, fuel marked on chalkboards, and canvas wings inspected in cold dawn as they had been for years. Bomb racks filled with the same steady rhythm, maps unfolded across the same worn tables, and crews climbed into cockpits without ceremony. Only later, in hindsight, did certain flights become last sortie toward a shrinking line of defenses, last glide above fields where gunfire had once risen sharply, last landing on a runway soon to fall silent. There were no celebrations on those nights. Instead, a kind of pause settled in tents and huts, a recognition not spoken aloud. Routine had carried them farther than fear ever could. When orders shifted from flying to packing equipment, the sound of rope coiling and canvas folding replaced engine hum. The women did not cheer victory. They acknowledged completion and began to understand that quiet endurance, not final headlines, marked their service. When peace arrived, it did not feel sudden. It gathered slowly in orders that no longer mentioned night flights and engines, left silent beneath tarps, in uniforms brushed clean and folded without urgency. Airstrips once crowded with maps and fuel cans emptied into quiet fields again. Returning home meant trading flight caps for scarves worn without frost, trading logbooks for notebooks where no coordinates needed marking. Neighbors greeted them as daughters, students, clerks. Roles paused at wars, beginning and resumed without ceremony at its close. Some spoke little about nights spent above dark countryside. Others offered simple explanations that did not capture windburned cheeks, frozen goggles, or the weight of maps studied by lantern light. There were no parades for wooden biplanes and silent glides. Yet in small apartments, on farm roads, and in university halls, hands that once gripped flight controls adjusted to everyday tasks with steady calm learned from years where routine meant survival. They returned not as figures carved into monuments, but as women who had done what war required, then stepped quietly back into ordinary life. After the war, stories of steel giants and sweeping offensives reached history books first. Names of divisions, commanders, and machines filled headlines and classrooms. The women who flew canvas wings into enemy lines found their place more slowly in journal entries, preserved log pages, and recollections spoken at modest gatherings. Some records named individual pilots and navigators, honoring sorties and bravery with formal citation. Others remained brief, listing only flight counts and dates beside initials. Not every contribution was traced, but each sortie carried weight even when archives captured only fragments. Memory here did not depend on monument height or parade ground presence. It lived in small displays curated years later, in museum glass beside uniforms, carefully pressed, and in documents read by those who sought quiet stories, rather than loud victories. Time did not erase their effort. It revealed its scale slowly, like dawn shaping horizon edges, allowing those who look closely to understand endurance measured not in fanfare but in persistence without pause. Their regiment flew thousands of sorties across countless nights, shaping battles not through force of metal but through constancy of will. They proved that determination did not need weight of armor to carry impact, that wooden wings could alter supply lines, and that silence could unsettle armies built on noise. Their story does not rest on mythology or heroic image. It rests on cold hands adjusting compass bearings, on patches sewn to hold canvas firm, on nights spent trusting wind more than sight. The night witches did not seek legend. They followed orders, refined skill, and returned to sky until sky no longer called them. Their strength was not spectacle. It was steadiness. And history, patient and thorough, now holds record of women who flew without protection, landed without fanfare, and served without expectation of applause. Their legacy is written in missions log, fields crossed in darkness, and the simple truth that discipline, repeated quietly, can shape the outcome of war as powerfully as any roar of engines. History remembers many battles won with steel and fire. Tonight, we remember victories carried by silence, by wooden wings in cold air, by maps held in gloved hands, by courage that never asked to be seen. The night witches did not chase glory. They flew because duty asked and returned because discipline allowed. If this story mattered to you, help it travel quietly as they once did, through darkness into light.